Frost clings to the inside of the window pane, tracing intricate webs of white across the glass in the bitter chill of an 1880 winter. The hearth holds nothing but powdery ash, a cold monument to the fire that burned out long before dawn. Welcome to Unwritten Axiom. I'm glad you're here. If finding shelter in these forgotten corners of history brings you peace, consider subscribing to return whenever the present feels too heavy. You open your eyes to a darkness that feels heavy and absolute, the kind of winter night that swallows the corners of the room. The wool blanket offers a meager defense against the biting draft leaking through the floorboards. You lie still for a moment, listening to the agonizing silence of the farmhouse. No heavy boots strike the timber floor. No familiar cough breaks the stillness. You push the blanket aside, bracing yourself as the freezing air hits your shoulders like a physical blow. The day demands your labor whether your heart is ready or not. Frost bites at your bare feet the second they touch the braided rug beside the bed. Ice has formed in the wash basin overnight, a solid block locking the tin pitcher in place. Shadows stretch long and distorted across the plaster walls as you fumble for a sulfur match in the pitch black. The match head scrapes against the rough stone of the fireplace, bursting into a brief and harsh yellow flare. A solitary candle catches the flame, casting a meager circle of light that barely reaches the foot of the bed. This is the hour of ghosts and memories. Work is the only reliable cure for both. You pull a heavy wool shawl around your shoulders, the rough fibers scratching familiar paths against your skin. The iron stove in the kitchen sits fully dead, radiating a chill that seeps straight into your bones. You kneel on the hardened earth of the hearthstone, clearing away the powdery gray ash with numb, uncooperative fingers. Splinters of kindling snap sharply in the hushed room as you build a small pyramid of pine over a knot of twisted paper. You strike another match, watching the fragile flame lick tentatively at the paper before biting into the dry wood. The fire hisses, a low and comforting sound that temporarily holds the immense loneliness of the house at bay. Smoke rises in a thin column carrying the sharp scent of pitch and resilience. Footsteps echo hollowly as you walk toward the heavy oak door leading to the yard. The iron latch sticks, frozen solid by the night's plunging temperatures, requiring 2 hard strikes from the heel of your hand to break free. Wind rushes into the kitchen immediately, a howling force carrying the scent of impending snow and crushed pine needles. The world outside the farmhouse remains plunged in a bruised purple, waiting for a sun that seems reluctant to rise. Snowdrifts bank against the side of the barn, pristine and unmarked by any boots but your own. The absolute isolation of this 1880 frontier winter presses down on the roof like an ocean of freezing water. Every task out here belongs strictly to your hands alone. You step off the porch, your leather boots breaking the crust of the snow with a sharp, percussive crunch. The freezing air sears your lungs with every inhale, a startling reminder of your own continued existence. You carry the wooden bucket toward the well, the iron handle biting mercilessly through the thin fabric of your mittens. The rope is stiff with ice, groaning in protest as you uncoil it from the wooden winch. You lower the bucket into the dark shaft, listening to the hollow scrape of wood against stone until a distant splash signals success. Cranking the heavy load back to the surface demands a burst of physical effort that leaves your arms trembling in the bitter cold. The water sloshes over the rim, instantly turning to ice on the frozen ground. Freezing water sloshes onto the hem of your wool skirt, turning into stiff, heavy boards that slap against your shins. The kitchen has gathered a fraction of heat from the stove, a meager victory in the daily battle against the elements. You pour the bucket into the iron kettle, the metal ringing with a dull, hollow tone. A handful of oats goes into a cast iron pot, the grains clicking against the sides like tiny stones. This unremarkable meal will provide the bare minimum of energy required to survive the grueling labor of the morning. Hunger is simply another chore to manage. You stand over the stove, watching the water tremble at the edges before breaking into a rolling boil. The heat radiates against your face, a stark contrast to the numbing cold still gripping your feet and hands. You stir the thickening oats with a wooden spoon, the repetitive circular motion offering a brief, mindless meditation. Your eyes drift to the empty chair at the opposite end of the rough-hewn table. He built that table from a fallen oak tree 3 summers ago, sanding the top until it felt like smooth glass beneath your palms. You force your gaze back to the bubbling pot, refusing to let the memory paralyze you. The farm will not wait for your grief to pass. Before dawn breaks, the animals in the barn begin to demand your attention. Their restless shifting echoes across the frozen yard, a chorus of stamping hooves and low, complaining grunts. The milk cows expect their morning hay, their massive bodies radiating the heat that makes the barn the warmest place on the property. The lantern light swings wildly as you cross the threshold, casting monstrous, leaping shadows against the rough timber walls. Sweet, fermented scents of old hay and manure fill the enclosed space, a smell tied directly to survival. The work here is brutal, unending, and fully necessary. Stopping means surrendering, and that is a luxury you cannot afford. You grab the iron pitchfork, its wooden handle polished to a high sheen by years of calloused hands. The hay bale resists your initial thrust, packed tight and frozen at the edges from the damp winter air. You drive your weight behind the tool, leveraging the heavy clump of dried grass into the wooden manger. The cows huff in appreciation, their rough tongues immediately wrapping around the feed with mechanical efficiency. You move down the line, distributing the hay with rhythmic, practiced motions that leave your back aching with dull familiarity. A stray barn cat wheezes between your boots, offering a brief, vibrating purr before vanishing into the shadows. You finish the feeding and lean heavily against the stall door, breathless and surrounded by the sounds of consumption. Outside, the eastern horizon finally begins to crack, bleeding a pale, watery gray across the frozen fields. The silhouettes of barren trees stand like skeletal sentinels against the lightening sky. The wind has died down, leaving a stillness so thorough it feels as though the entire world is holding its breath. Smoke from your kitchen chimney rises in a perfectly straight column, the only sign of human life for miles in any direction. This harsh 1880 landscape demands everything from those foolish enough to try and tame it. The soil takes sweat, the winter takes warmth, and sometimes the frontier takes the people you love. Surviving another morning is the only retaliation available. You trudge back to the house, your boots dragging slightly in the deepening snowdrifts. The oats have cooled into a thick, unappetizing paste, but you eat them standing beside the stove anyway. The coarse texture scratches your throat, providing bulk if not comfort or joy. You wash it down with a cup of bitter, steeped chicory, a poor substitute for coffee that only serves to color the hot water. The warm liquid settles in your stomach, a small anchor of heat against the permeating chill of the room. You rinse the tin bowl and the remaining warm water, setting it face down on the wooden draining board. The day has officially begun, stretching out before you in a long, unbroken line of demanding chores. Faded calico hangs from a rusted nail near the pantry door. The fabric bears the permanent stains of blackberry juice, soot, and countless hours of domestic labor. Tying the strings around your waist feels like donning armor for the battles of the frontier. The washboard sits in the corner, a corrugated instrument of torture waiting to strip the skin from your knuckles. A mountain of soiled linens and heavy wool garments rests in a woven basket beside it. The water must be hauled, heated, and hauled again before the sun reaches its zenith. This grueling cycle of cleanliness is a stubborn refusal to let the chaos of the wilderness consume the home. You heft the massive copper-washed boiler onto the hottest part of the iron stove, wincing as the metal clangs loudly. It takes 4 trips to the well to fill the massive vessel, each journey leaving you slightly more depleted than the last. The water heats slowly, mocking your impatience as you sort the garments by their level of grime. You shave slivers of harsh lye soap into the heating water, watching the white flakes dissolve into a murky, caustic broth. Your hands plunge into the scalding water, the sudden heat shocking your skin before the lye begins its unyielding work. You scrub a stained collar against the ridges of the glass washboard, putting the full weight of your shoulders into every downward thrust. The physical exertion forces the lingering sorrow to the back of your mind, replacing emotional pain with muscular burning. Steam fills the small kitchen, rolling down the cold window panes in thick, weeping droplets. The air becomes oppressive and damp, carrying the sharp, chemical odor of the melted soap. Wet fabric slaps rhythmically against the metal basin, a wet, heavy sound that dominates the muted house. Shirts are wrung out by hand, the twisting motion sending sharp spikes of pain through exhausted wrists and forearms. The wrung garments are tossed into a wooden rinsing tub, forming a damp, heavy pile of temporary victory. Hours pass in this humid, back-breaking haze, marking the progression of the morning solely by the shrinking size of the laundry basket. You carry the heavy wicker basket of wet laundry out to the yard, the damp weight pressing painfully against your hip. The freezing air immediately assaults the steaming fabric, stiffening the wet wool before you can even reach the clothesline. You fumble with the wooden clothespins, your fingers turning red and clumsy in the bitter cold. Pinning a frozen sheet to the hemp line requires wrestling the stiff fabric into submission, a bizarre fight against a textile opponent. The frozen garments hang like rigid boards in the pale morning light, grotesque statues of empty clothing swaying slightly in the breeze. You rub your raw, aching hands together, blowing warm breath onto your knuckles in a futile attempt to restore circulation. The basket is empty, but your body feels fully drained of its reserves. Midday approaches without any significant increase in warmth of sunlight. The pale disk of the sun hides behind a thick blanket of unbroken gray clouds, casting a flat, shadowless light over the farm. A solitary crow lands on the fence post near the barn, its black feathers a stark contrast to the endless expanse of white snow. It tilts its head, fixing a glassy eye on the farmhouse before letting out a single harsh call that shatters the silence. The bird takes flight a moment later, disappearing into the skeletal branches of the distant tree line. The isolation of the property is absolute, a lonely island of human endeavor lost in an ocean of untamed winter. The nearest neighbor lives 3 miles down a road that is currently impassable. You return to the kitchen, seeking the meager sanctuary of the iron stove. Your wet apron goes over the back of a chair to dry, the fabric steaming faintly as it catches the heat. You cut a thick slice of dense rye bread from the loaf on the counter, the crust resisting the knife with stubborn determination. A thin smear of preserved apple butter provides the only flavor for the midday meal. You sit at the table to eat, staring blankly at the frost forming delicate patterns in the lower half of the window pane. The silence in the room is deafening, an overwhelming void that presses against your eardrums until they ring. You finish the bread quickly, eager to find another task to drown out the oppressive quiet. Dull iron shears rest on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. The metal blade sits slightly warped, refusing to close perfectly over the jumble of wooden spools and bent needles inside a battered tin box. This container holds the tools of endless mending, the perpetual battle against fraying edges and tearing seams. Socks with holes the size of walnuts await their turn, alongside a heavy winter coat missing 3 crucial buttons. The frontier exacts a heavy toll on fabric, wearing clothes down to threads with relentless friction and hard labor. Repairing these garments is not a choice, but a vital necessity for surviving the plunging temperatures. You stretch a heavy wool sock over a wooden darning mushroom, pulling the damaged fibers tight over the smooth, rounded top. The needle flashes in the weak light as you weave a lattice of coarse yarn over the gaping hole. Your eyes strain to see the tiny stitches, the gray afternoon light offering little assistance for the detailed work. The repetitive motion of weaving over and under brings a strange, hypnotic calm to your racing mind. You focus thoroughly on the tension of the yarn, ensuring the repair lies flat and smooth against the surrounding wool. A poorly donned sock will blister a heel within hours, turning a minor annoyance into a crippling injury. You tie off the thread and bite the end clean, tossing the repaired sock into a growing pile on the table. Roasted root vegetables release a heavy, earthy aroma that masks the lingering scent of lye soap. Turnips and carrots sizzle softly in the cast iron skillet, their edges browning against the rendered pork fat. The heat from the stove has finally permeated the room, creating a small bubble of livable warmth in the freezing house. Outside, the wind begins to pick up again, howling around the corners of the farmhouse with a mournful, hollow sound. The wooden shutters rattle against their iron latches, protesting the sudden assault of the winter gale. The contrast between the harsh environment outside and the small, fragrant warmth inside highlights the fragile nature of this frontier existence. You check the vegetables with a wooden spatula, turning the brown pieces to expose the paler sides to the hot fat. The mundane task anchors you to the present moment, keeping the creeping shadows of grief temporarily at bay. You reach into the salt crot, pinching a small amount of the precious mineral to sprinkle over the sizzling roots. The crystals hit the hot iron with a sharp crackle, releasing a brief puff of savory steam into the air. This solitary meal requires no conversation, no forced cheerfulness, and no pretending that the empty chair does not exist. You will eat standing up, watching the weather worsen through the frosted glass. Survival in 1880 is measured in these small, solitary victories against hunger and cold. Wood must be brought in before the storm truly breaks over the valley. The stack against the side of the house is dwindling rapidly, a terrifying prospect as the temperatures continue to plummet. Heavy leather gloves shield vulnerable skin from the splintered edges of the split oak and pine. The frozen logs stick together, requiring a sharp kick from a heavy boot to separate them from the pile. Splinters of ice fly into the air with every strike, stinging exposed cheeks and noses with punishing force. An armful of wood weighs heavily against the chest, straining tired back muscles and threatening to throw off an already precarious balance. The journey back to the kitchen door is a race against the biting wind. You drop the load of firewood into the cast iron bin beside the stove with a deafening, chaotic clatter. Dust and bits of dried bark scatter across the freshly swept floorboards, demanding yet another round with the broom. You ignore the mess for now, prioritizing the immediate need to feed the hungry flames within the firebox. A heavy log goes in, instantly enveloped by the greedy, dancing fire. You slam the heavy iron door shut, sealing the heat inside, and adjusting the damper with a soot-stained rag. The fire roars in response to the fresh fuel, a furious, contained beast fighting against the encroaching winter. You stand before it, absorbing the heat until your frozen trousers begin to steam faintly in the warm air. Shadows stretch longer across the kitchen floor as midday yields to the early dimness of afternoon. The wind continues to batter the sides of the house, rattling the window frames and finding every microscopic gap in the plaster. Small piles of fine, powdery snow accumulate on the inside sills, blown through the invisible cracks by the sheer force of the gale. The temperature inside the house begins to drop away from the immediate vicinity of the stove, reclaiming the corners and the hallways. Winter holds this valley in an iron grip, refusing to offer any reprieve or quarter to the inhabitants. The work of staying alive is a constant, unending negotiation with the elements. You sweep the scattered bark into a neat pile, the stiff bristles of the broom scratching rhythmically against the floorboards. The physical motion offers a small measure of control over an environment that constantly threatens to overwhelm you. You scoop the debris into an iron dustpan and toss it into the stove, watching the dry flakes incinerate instantly in the intense heat. The house is clean, the animals are fed, and the laundry hangs frozen on the line. You allow yourself a moment to sit in the rocking chair beside the hearth, your muscles trembling slightly as the tension drains from them. The chair creaks under your weight, a familiar sound that echoes loudly in the empty room. You close your eyes, gathering strength for the hours that still lie ahead. Yellowed paper rests on the mantel, its edges curled from weeks of proximity to the fire. The handwriting on the front is slanted and rushed, carrying a postmark from a town hundreds of miles away. It arrived weeks ago, brought by a neighbor who braved the snowdrifts on horseback to deliver the mail. The letter contains news that severed a life in two, drawing a permanent line between the past and the present. It remains unopened since the first reading, a physical artifact of the moment the world stopped making sense. The ink on the page holds the power to shatter the fragile peace earned through hours of backbreaking labor. Leaving it on the mantel is a conscious decision to delay the pain until the day is done. You stare at the envelope, your pulse quickening with a surge of uninvited anxiety. The desire to read the words again wrestles with the desperate need to keep your composure intact. You reach out, your fingertips brushing the coarse paper before pulling back sharply, as if burned. The memory of the phrases within is seared into your mind, requiring no physical reading to inflict their damage. You turn away from the mantelpiece, forcing your attention toward the iron kettle bubbling on the stove. Work remains the only barrier between you and the crushing weight of the grief. You pick up the broom again, sweeping a floor that needs no sweeping, simply to keep your hands moving. Violent gusts howl down the chimney, sending a puff of fine gray ash into the kitchen. The draft chills the room instantly, a sharp reminder of the storm raging just beyond the wooden walls. The sky outside has darkened from pale gray to a bruised, turbulent charcoal, signaling the arrival of heavy snow. The light fails rapidly, forcing the premature lighting of the oil lamps hanging from the ceiling beams. The yellow glow pools on the table and the stove, leaving the rest of the room shrouded in thick, impenetrable shadows. The isolation deepens with the falling light, contracting the known world to the boundaries of this single room. You trim the wick of the nearest lamp, adjusting the small wheel until the flame burns even and bright. The smell of kerosene mixes with the roasting vegetables, creating a scent uniquely tied to winter evenings on the frontier. You draw the heavy curtains across the windows, shutting out the sight of the blowing snow and the encroaching night. The fabric acts as a meager shield against the cold, trapping a layer of dead air between the room and the frozen glass. You pull the rocking chair closer to the stove, leaning forward to absorb the radiant heat directly into your chest. The silence settles heavily around you, pressing inward from the dark corners. You wrap the wool shawl tighter, preparing to face the long, unbroken hours of the evening. The light outside the frosted window panes shifts from a bruised gray to a heavy, suffocating charcoal as the storm tightens its grip on the valley. Wind batters the wooden siding of the farmhouse with a rhythmic, percussive force that makes the structural timbers groan in protest. The brief respite in the rocking chair concludes as you let the radiant heat of the cast iron stove penetrate the damp wool of your skirt one last time. A stray draft snakes across the floorboards, biting at your ankles and reminding you that the brutal weather demands attention. The animals will need a final check before the blizzard renders the path to the barn impassable for the night. You push yourself up from the creaking chair, the familiar ache in your lower back radiating outward with every rigid movement. You force your aching feet into heavy leather boots that sit stiff and unyielding beside the door. Their rigid laces have frozen into twisted coils from the morning chores, requiring a frustrating battle to pull them tight over your raw heels. A massive buffalo hide coat hangs on a wooden peg, weighing almost as much as a small child, offering the only real defense against the plummeting temperatures. You wrap a thick woven scarf around your lower face, leaving only your eyes exposed to the biting air, and pull a fur-lined cap down low over your forehead. The iron lantern requires a firm hand to light, the sulfur match striking a harsh yellow spark against the glass chimney. A deep breath fills your lungs before you grasp the iron handle of the door. Bracing your shoulder against the wood as you lift the heavy latch, you fight to pull the door shut behind you, throwing your entire body weight against the howling gale until the latch finally clicks into place. The wind rips across the porch, attempting to tear the lantern from your grasp while slamming snow into your exposed eyes. The world outside is a churning nightmare of white, the snow falling so fast and thick that the barn, a mere 50 yards away, is swallowed by the whiteout. The lantern light cuts only a few feet into the overwhelming darkness, catching the chaotic dance of the snowflakes in a hypnotic, dizzying display. Stepping off the porch requires plunging into drifts that have already reached your knees, the frozen crust scraping viciously against your shins. The terrifying isolation of an 880 winter storm wraps around you, shrinking the known universe to the tiny circle of yellow light. Every step forward demands a monumental exertion of force, a brutal wrestling match against an invisible, freezing enemy. The wind screams in your ears, a high-pitched mechanical shriek that drowns out the sound of your own ragged breathing. You lower your head, letting the thick buffalo hide absorb the brunt of the icy assault. Navigating by memory and the subtle slope of the frozen ground, panic flashes briefly in your chest, a primal fear becoming lost and frozen just yards from your own doorstep. You force the terror down, focusing wholly on the mechanical repetition of lifting one heavy boot and planting it ahead of the other. The bitter cold bites through the thick scarf, freezing the moisture from your breath into sharp, tiny icicles against your skin. You drag your frozen hands across the rough-hewn siding of the barn, finding the heavy wooden door by touch rather than sight. Ice has sealed the edges shut, requiring a desperate, frantic series of kicks from your heavy boots to break the frozen bond. The door groans inward, releasing a wave of warm, humid air that smells intensely of damp hay, manure, and living animals. You slip inside and heave the door shut against the storm, leaning against the rough planks while your lungs burn for oxygen. The lantern casts long, swaying shadows across the stalls, illuminating the breath of the cows rising in thick, white plumes. The animals shift restlessly in their stalls, unnerved by the roaring wind tearing at the cedar shingles above their heads. The animals shift their massive weight nervously, seeking comfort in the familiar routine of the evening feeding. You walk down the central aisle, the thick layer of straw muffling the heavy thud of your snow-covered boots. The water troughs have developed a thin crust of ice, which you shatter with the heavy iron head of a splitting maul. Fresh water flows from the internal hand pump, the mechanism screeching loudly as the freezing liquid rushes into the wooden basins. The cows drink greedily, their massive sides expanding and contracting in the shadowy, swaying lantern light. You check the latches on every single stall, ensuring the livestock remains secure against the panic that a severe blizzard can induce. You position the three-legged milking stool beside the largest Guernsey, resting your forehead against her warm, coarse flank. The wooden seat has been polished to a high sheen by years of daily use, offering a familiar anchor in the dim barn. The alternating hiss of milk hitting the tin pail provides a comforting counterpoint to the howling wind outside. Your hands move with practiced, mechanical efficiency, coaxing the rich, warm liquid from the udders despite the stiffness in your joints. The cow shifts her weight, chewing her cud with a deliberate rhythm that grounds you in the immediate reality of the task. You finish the milking and cover the pail with a piece of clean muslin, ensuring no stray straw contaminates the precious yield. You toss extra rations of hay into the wooden mangers, a necessary precaution in case the storm rages through the following day. The pitchfork lifts fresh straw over the packed dirt floors, providing an extra layer of insulation against the creeping frost. The draft horses nicker as you pass their stall, their massive heads turning to follow the swaying lantern light. You run a gloved hand down the nearest horse's neck, feeling the immense coiled power beneath the thick winter coat. The barn represents survival, a fragile arc of life holding back the deadly forces of the frontier winter. You double-check the heavy iron bar on the main door, confirming the structure is as secure as human hands can make it. Stepping back out into the blizzard requires gathering every ounce of remaining willpower, a mental bracing against the inevitable physical pain. The wind catches the heavy wooden door immediately, attempting to rip it from its hinges before you wrestle it shut and drop the exterior latch. The journey back to the farmhouse is a terrifying plunge into absolute darkness, the lantern light now struggling to pierce even a single foot of the blowing snow. You keep your head down, trusting the faint, trampled trench you left behind to guide your boots back to the porch. The cold sears your lungs with every inhale, turning each breath into an exhausting chore. A surge of adrenaline washes over you as the wooden edge of the porch steps finally materializes out of the blinding white. You throw your weight against the kitchen door, tumbling into the room along with a sweeping drift of snow. The sudden hush of the interior is jarring, a stark contrast to the deafening roar of the gale that still batters the exterior walls. You slam the door shut and throw the heavy iron deadbolt, sealing the farmhouse against the chaotic fury of the night. The buffalo coat is shed with stiff, clumsy fingers, the heavy garment dropping to the floorboards with a dull thud. You strip off the frozen scarf and cap, hanging them near the stove to thaw before the radiating heat. The milk pail is set carefully on the counter, its precious contents still warm despite the harrowing journey across the yard. The kitchen retains a comfortable pocket of heat, the cast iron stove having done its vital work while you battled the elements. The skillet of roasted root vegetables waits on the warmer, the carrots and turnips now caramelized and slightly wrinkled from the steady heat. A small jar of pickled beets sits in the pantry, its vibrant magenta contents offering a stark contrast to the dull grays and browns of the winter diet. You pry the lid off with the edge of a spoon, the sharp, vinegary scent cutting through the heavy aroma of wood smoke and damp wool. A cracked ceramic plate serves as your dinnerware, the chipped edges a testament to years of practical frontier meals. You arrange the food with a deliberate care, elevating the humble ingredients into a necessary evening ritual. You pull the rocking chair to the table, preferring its worn comfort to the stiff, straight-back chairs that line the opposite side. The first bite of the roasted turnip is sweet and earthy, the salt crystals providing a sharp, welcome contrast. You chew without hurrying, letting the savory warmth spread through your exhausted body, chasing the lingering chill from your bones. The wind screams down the chimney, sending a puff of fine gray ash dancing across the hearthstone. You ignore the draft, focusing on the mechanical process of replenishing the calories burned during the brutal barn chores. The emptiness in the room is heavy, an almost physical presence that sits in the unoccupied chair across from you. You fetch a clean, wide-mouthed crock from the pantry to filter the milk before the cream begins to separate. A fine muslin cloth is stretched over the opening and secured tight with a piece of rough twine. The warm milk pours smoothly from the tin pail, filtering down through the fabric to catch any microscopic impurities. The rhythmic splashing sound fills the kitchen, a domestic melody that has echoed through this farmhouse for countless evenings. You set the full crock in the coolest corner of the pantry, ensuring the dairy stays fresh for the morning churning. The muslin is tossed into the rinsing tub, adding one more item to the endless cycle of frontier labor. You carry the heavy tangle of a stiff leather harness to the table, its thick straps cracked from the relentless winter air. A tin of neatsfoot oil sits beside a piece of soft flannel, ready to condition the parched hide. You soak the cloth in the amber liquid before rubbing it deeply into the leather, using tight, circular motions. The repetitive task is soothing, allowing your frantic thoughts to finally settle into a manageable rhythm. The oil smells pungent and animalistic, a scent that mingles heavily with the lingering wood smoke in the warm kitchen. You work the lubricant into every buckle and seam, ensuring the critical equipment will not snap under the strain of a heavy load. The yellowed envelope remains untouched on the mantelpiece, its edges curled from weeks of proximity to the fire. The flickering lamplight casts dancing shadows across the slanted handwriting, animating the ink in a mocking spectral display. Reading that letter tonight would invite a collapse you simply cannot afford, a surrender to a grief that would leave the morning chores undone. The farm demands a stoic resilience, an unwavering commitment to survival that leaves no room for emotional disintegration. You set your jaw, focusing intensely on the gleam of the freshly oiled leather. Building a mental wall against the sorrow pressing at the edges of your mind is a daily requirement. You use the heavy iron poker to break apart the remaining embers in the stove, creating a glowing bed of red heat. Two massive, unsplit pieces of dense hickory are wrestled into the firebox, their thick bark hissing instantly as it touches the coals. You adjust the dampers carefully, choking off the oxygen supply just enough to ensure a steady burn that will last until dawn. The metal door clings shut, sealing the heat inside the heavy iron belly of the stove. You wipe a streak of soot from your cheek with the back of a wrist, feeling the dry heat radiate against your skin. The warmth is a hard-won luxury, purchased with sweat and endless physical exertion. A wooden mantel clock ticks reliably on a high shelf, its brass pendulum swinging in a hypnotic, unvarying rhythm. You retrieve the small brass key from its hook, fitting it into the dual winding holes on the painted face. The ratcheting sound of the springs tightening echoes sharply in the room, a harsh mechanical noise that cuts through the whistling wind. You wind both the time and strike springs, ensuring the progression of hours will not falter during the long night. The clock serves as an anchor, a rigid measurement of passing time that provides a comforting structure to the chaotic wilderness. You close the glass door and step back, watching the pendulum slice through the shadows. You place a small copper kettle on the hottest plate of the stove, listening for the faint, high-pitched hum that signals impending steam. A handful of dried peppermint leaves goes into a tin cup, their sharp, menthol scent releasing into the dry air. The boiling water hits the leaves with a soft splash, turning the liquid a pale, translucent green. You wrap both hands around the hot metal cup, letting the searing heat seep through the calluses on your palms. The mint tea clears the dust and wood smoke from your throat, a necessary comfort in a life defined by harsh obligation. You stand near the stove, absorbing the heat while the storm rages unabated outside. The storm lantern used for the barn journey sits on the counter, its glass chimney thick with soot and smelling the burned kerosene. You unscrew the wire guard, carefully lifting the fragile glass cylinder free from the metal base. A piece of crumpled newspaper serves as a polishing rag, squeaking sharply against the glass as you rub away the greasy black residue. The clean chimney reveals a wick that is burned unevenly, requiring a quick trim with the dull iron shears. You strike a match and test the flame, watching it burn in a perfect glowing crescent before blowing it out. The clean lantern is set back on its hook, ready for whatever emergency the blizzard might bring before sunrise. You sit back in the rocking chair, sipping the cooling mint tea, listening to the symphony of the struggling structure. The farmhouse groans under the relentless assault of the wind, the massive timber joints shifting and settling with eerie human-like complaints. A loose shingle slaps repeatedly against the roof, a frantic, tapping rhythm that frays the edges of your tired nerves. The floorboards creak as the temperature fluctuates, the wood contracting in the extreme cold, radiating from the cellar. This house is a living entity, an aging wooden shell that fights the winter alongside you, bearing the scars of countless storms. You close your eyes, trusting the thick beams to hold fast against the chaotic fury howling outside. You slide the wooden crate of seeds from beneath the window, resting it heavily across your knees to examine the contents. These small paper envelopes and cloth sacks hold the seeds for the spring planting, a tangible promise of life that feels impossibly distant. You untie a small sack of heirloom beans, pouring the smooth, speckled seeds into the palm of your hand. The hard kernels click against each other, carrying the genetic memory of sunlit fields and warm summer rain. You run your thumb over the smooth surfaces, a quiet act of faith in a future currently buried under feet of snow. The simple act of sorting seeds pushes the suffocating reality of the winter night slightly further away. A whetstone rests on the edge of the kitchen table, its gray surface slightly concave from years of abrasive friction. You retrieve a carbon steel paring knife from the drawer, its edge dulled from cutting tough root vegetables and stubborn twine. A few drops of water darken the stone before you drag the blade across the surface in smooth, sweeping arcs. The rasping sound of steel on stone is sharp and metallic, a purposeful noise that cuts through the howling of the blizzard. You test the edge against the pad of your thumb, feeling the microscopic burr that indicates a deadly sharpness. The knife is wiped clean on a rag and returned to the drawer, another tool prepared for the endless demands of tomorrow. You feel a distinct chill settling over your shoulders as the perimeter of the kitchen begins to surrender to the cold. The radiant heat of the stove struggles to reach the furthest corners, leaving the edges of the room trapped in a freezing draft. The frosted window panes have thickened, the delicate crystalline webs merging into solid sheets of opaque white ice. You pull the rocking chair a few inches closer to the iron stove, shrinking your world down to the small, illuminated circle of warmth. The rest of the house exists in a state of suspended animation, frozen corridors and dark rooms that hold nothing but shadows and memories. You curl your legs beneath you, pulling the edges of the shawl tight against the creeping frost. The brass pendulum continues its relentless march, slicing seconds away with mechanical precision. You stare at the painted face of the clock, watching the minute hand inch toward the bottom of the dial. Time moves differently in a blizzard. It stretches and distorts, transforming a single evening into a sprawling, endless epoch. You find yourself counting the ticks, a mesmerizing hollow rhythm that matches the steady beating of your own exhausted heart. The storm outside shows no signs of breaking, the wind maintaining its furious, high-pitched scream against the eaves. You sip the last of the tepid mint tea, the liquid now carrying a slightly metallic taste from the tin cup. You recognize the physical toll of the day settling deeply into your muscles, a heavy, leaden ache that throbs in time with your pulse. The blistered heels sting against the wool socks, the scraped knuckles burn, and the lower back pulses with a dull, persistent pain. Yet, amidst the physical misery, a stubborn satisfaction takes root in the center of your chest. The animals are secure, the wood is chopped, the milk is filtered, and the house remains standing against the worst the frontier can throw at it. You have survived another grueling rotation of the sun, relying solely on your own strength and unyielding determination. The grief remains, a heavy stone sitting in the background, but it has not broken you today. You rise from the rocking chair with a slow, deliberate groan, your stiff muscles protesting the sudden movement after sitting too long. The iron stove continues its steady radiation of heat, but the sheer ferocity of the blizzard outside begins to overpower the small cast iron belly. A heavy basket woven from willow branches sits in the far corner of the kitchen, filled to the brim with scraps of discarded fabric and torn clothing. You carry the awkward container back to the hearth, dropping it onto the braided rug with a muted thud that barely registers over the howling wind. Sorting these remnants is a task specifically reserved for the longest, darkest hours of the winter, a chore that requires patience rather than raw physical power. The rag rug currently covering the floor beneath your feet took 3 brutal seasons to complete, and the next one demands your immediate attention. You examine the faded calico and torn wool spilling over the rim of the basket, a chaotic cascade of muted colors and rough textures in the lamplight. The fabrics carry the distinct history of the farm within their worn threads, each scrap representing a garment that survived years of hard labor before finally surrendering to the elements. You reach into the pile, pulling out a strip of indigo-dyed cotton that once belonged to a sturdy work shirt. The material feels surprisingly soft between your calloused fingers, the rough fibers having been beaten into submission by countless rounds against the glass washboard. A pair of heavy iron shears sits waiting on the table, their dull blades perfectly suited for ripping rather than executing precise cuts. Transforming this pile of ruined clothing into a functional floor covering is the ultimate act of frontier resourcefulness, refusing to let even the smallest scrap go to waste. You grip the handles of the heavy shears, forcing the stiff iron blades through the indigo cotton with a harsh, tearing sound. The fabric rips cleanly along the grain, leaving a pile of long, narrow strips that will eventually form the sturdy core of the new rug. The repetitive nature of the cutting brings a strange, methodical calm to your racing thoughts, a welcome distraction from the deafening roar of the gale. You sort the strips by color and texture, creating distinct piles of wool, cotton, and coarse linen on the floorboards beside the hearth. The kerosene lamp casts a warm golden glow over your makeshift workstation, illuminating the floating dust motes that dance in the drafts. Your hands move with a practiced rhythm, the muscle memory taking over while your mind remains firmly tethered to the rhythmic clicking of the mantel clock. By midnight, temperature inside the farmhouse drops another crucial degree, forcing the encroaching frost further up the window panes. The heavy oak beams supporting the roof groan under the immense weight of the accumulating snow, a deep structural complaint that reverberates through the entire foundation. You pause your cutting to listen to the house settle, interpreting the various creaks and snaps the way a sailor reads the rigging of a ship. The structure holds firm, but the relentless pressure of the 1880 blizzard serves as a constant reminder of nature's terrifying supremacy. A sudden gust of wind rattles the iron latch on the kitchen door, briefly mimicking the sound of a harsh knock before fading back into a sustained howl. The isolation of the property feels absolute, a solitary island of meager warmth floating in an ocean of freezing white violence. You set the iron shears aside, your thumb throbbing with a dull ache from the pressure of the heavy metal handles. 3 long strips of contrasting fabric are tied together at one end, secured tightly with a thick piece of waxed twine. You pin the knotted end under the heavy heel of your leather boot, anchoring the material so you can apply the necessary tension for a tight, even braid. The motion of crossing the strips over one another requires a precise, rhythmic twisting of the wrists, a technique learned decades ago by the light of a similar fire. The braided rope lengthens slowly, forming a dense, colorful serpent that coils across the floorboards as you work. This tedious process transforms worthless rags into a thick, insulating layer that will eventually offer a small mercy to bare feet on freezing winter mornings. Across the room, the wood box sits alarmingly empty, the remaining logs providing only enough fuel to maintain the current temperature until the early hours. The iron stove demands constant attention, a hungry iron beast that requires regular feeding to keep the creeping frost at bay. You abandon the braided rug momentarily, stepping over the piles of fabric to retrieve the iron poker resting against the masonry. The glowing embers in the firebox hiss and pop as you stir them, sending a shower of bright orange sparks dancing toward the heavy iron damper. 2 thick pieces of split hickory are wrestled into the flames, the dense wood resisting the fire for a moment before catching with a sudden flare. The heat radiates immediately, pressing against your face and hands as you quickly secure the iron door, locking the precious warmth inside. You retrieve a worn leather-bound ledger from the top shelf of the pantry, its pages stiff and smelling faintly of mildew and old ink. This book contains the meticulous records of the farm spanning over a decade, a precise accounting of yields, losses, and the brutal mathematics of survival. You carry it to the table, pulling the kerosene lamp closer until the yellow light pools brightly across the open pages. The columns of numbers dictate the reality of your existence, tracking every bushel of wheat and every pound of rendered fat with unforgiving accuracy. You run your finger down a column from 3 years prior, comparing the bitter winter of that season to the storm currently raging outside the walls. The ink is faded in places, smudged by sweaty thumbs and frantic calculations made during years when the harvest fell dangerously short. You brace yourself as the wind abruptly changes direction, striking the northern wall of the farmhouse with the force of a physical blow. The sudden shift sends a terrifying shudder through the timber frame, rattling the ceramic plates stacked neatly in the wooden cupboard. You grip the edges of the table, your knuckles turning white as you wait for the agonizing groan of the wood to subside. The blizzard is searching for a weakness, testing every window casing and door frame for a microscopic gap to exploit. Fine, powdery snow forces its way through the invisible seams around the door frame, forming a small, pristine drift on the interior floorboards. The visual evidence of the storm's intrusion is alarming, a stark reminder that the wooden walls offer only a temporary illusion of total security. You grab an old woolen rag from the washstand, soaking it quickly in the basin before wringing out the excess water. You kneel beside the kitchen door, pressing the damp cloth firmly into the crack where the snow is bleeding through the wooden frame. The freezing air immediately assaults your bare hands, turning your fingers stiff and clumsy as you work the fabric into the narrow gap. The wet wool will freeze solid within minutes, creating an impenetrable ice seal that should hold until the wind shifts again. You press your shoulder against the heavy oak planks, checking the integrity of the iron hinges and the heavy wooden bar dropped across the center brackets. Satisfied with the makeshift repair, you wipe your hands on your apron, the coarse fabric scratching against your chilled, reddened skin. You walk back to the table, your boots leaving faint, damp footprints across the floorboards where the snow had intruded. The ledger remains open under the lamplight, but the columns of numbers no longer command your immediate attention. Your gaze drifts toward a small, wooden shaker box sitting on the highest shelf of the dresser, its oval lid perfectly fitted to the bentwood base. He crafted that box during your first winter in this valley, steaming the cherry wood over a boiling kettle until it bent to his will. You resist the urge to pull it down, knowing that handling the keepsakes inside would require an emotional fortitude you simply do not possess tonight. You close the ledger with a sharp, definitive snap, sliding it back into its designated space on the pantry shelf, before turning your attention back to the mundane chores. A heavy iron coffee mill is clamped to the edge of the counter, its cast iron hopper waiting for the morning supply of roasted chicory root. The handle features a polished wooden knob, worn smooth by the daily friction of preparing the bitter frontier brew. You scoop a handful of the dark, roasted chunks from a burlap sack, pouring them into the metal funnel with a harsh, rattling sound. Turning the crank requires a firm, steady pressure, the grinding mechanism crushing the tough roots with a loud, abrasive crunch that momentarily drowns out the howling wind. The pungent, earthy smell of the chicory fills the immediate area, a sharp aroma that lacks the rich comfort of real coffee, but provides the necessary illusion. The ground powder falls into the small wooden drawer below, ready to be steeped in boiling water before the sun rises. You slide the wooden drawer out from the mill, checking the consistency of the dark powder under the flickering light of the kerosene lamp. The grind is coarse but sufficient for the heavy tin percolator that sits idle on the back of the stove. You transfer the chicory into a small, airtight glass jar, sealing it tightly to preserve whatever faint flavor the roots still possess. The physical exertion of the grinding leaves your shoulder aching, a dull, familiar throb that joins the chorus above the localized pains spreading throughout your body. You wipe the cast iron hopper clean with a dry cloth, ensuring the oil from the roots does not turn rancid and ruin the next batch. Preparing for the morning feels like a defiant act against the storm, a stubborn assertion that you fully expect to see another dawn. Deep winter night settles over the property with a crushing, suffocating weight that makes the air itself feel heavy and thick. The temperature continues its relentless plunge, freezing the moisture in the air and coating the interior nails of the roof with thick layers of white frost. The ticking of the mantle clock seems to echo louder in the profound stillness between the violent gusts of wind, marking the slow, agonizing passage of the darkest hours. A solitary mouse scuttles across the floorboards in the pantry, the tiny scratching sound amplifying the intense, overwhelming quiet of the lonely farmhouse. The fire in the stove has settled into a steady, radiant burn, the iron radiating a dry heat that fights a losing battle against the permeating chill. The shadows in the corners of the room appear to lengthen and shift, playing cruel tricks on exhausted, straining eyes. You pull the heavy buffalo coat from its wooden peg, spreading the massive garment across the back of the rocking chair to warm before the fire. The thick hide will provide an extra layer of insulation when the stove inevitably burns down to embers in the deepest part of the night. You check the kerosene lamp, noting the shrinking pool of clear liquid remaining in the glass reservoir. Adjusting the small brass wheel lowers the wick, reducing the flame to a mere sliver of yellow light to conserve the precious fuel. The dimness immediately transforms the kitchen, shrinking the visible world to the hearth and the table, while plunging the rest of the room into absolute darkness. You sit heavily in the chair, pulling the edges of the warm buffalo hide around your shivering shoulders. You stare into the tiny cracks around the cast iron door of the stove, watching the bright orange firelight flicker through the microscopic gaps. The heat against your shins is intense, a sharp contrast to the freezing draft biting at the back of your neck. Your hands rest loosely in your lap, the calluses and fresh scratches standing out starkly against your pale, tired skin. You flex your fingers, feeling the stiffness in the joints that only a lifetime of brutal physical labor can produce. The wind howls again, a mournful, echoing sound that seems to carry the voices of all the people who have suffered through this unforgiving frontier. You tighten your grip on the thick fur of the coat, letting the rough texture ground you in the brutal, immediate reality of survival. Beside the stove, a pair of worn leather boots sits waiting for a necessary repair, their soles thinning dangerously from miles of frozen terrain. A small wooden box containing brass tacks, an iron cobbler's hammer, and a block of hardened beeswax rests on the floorboards nearby. The leather requires constant maintenance to remain waterproof, a failure of which would lead to frostbite and the loss of toes within a matter of hours. The heavy boots smell faintly of damp earth and animal fat, the lingering odors of the barn and the pasture permanently embedded in the tough hide. A thick needle and a spool of waxed linen thread wait to mend the fraying seams, tools of a trade forced upon those who cannot afford the luxury of a professional cobbler. The work is tedious and exact, demanding a level of focus that is difficult to summon in the dead of night. You pick up the left boot, turning it over to inspect the worn heel under the dim, flickering light of the low-burning lamp. The leather is scuffed and gray, the original rich brown color hidden beneath layers of dried mud and protective grease. You position the thick sole over the small iron anvil, securing it firmly with your knees before tapping a brass tack into the loose edge. The sharp ping of the hammer striking the metal echoes sharply in the quiet kitchen, a decisive, industrious sound that cuts through the melancholy. You drive 3 more tacks into the heel, ensuring the repair is solid enough to withstand the brutal punishment of the frozen yard tomorrow. The physical act of repairing the footwear offers a tangible sense of accomplishment, a small victory in the endless war against decay. You heat the block of beeswax against the side of the iron stove, letting the edge soften slightly before rubbing it vigorously along the newly mended seam. The wax fills the tiny holes left by the brass tacks, creating a watertight seal that will keep the freezing snow away from your fragile skin. You buff the stiff leather with a scrap of rough canvas, the friction warming the wax and driving it deep into the pores of the parched hide. The boot looks ugly and patched, a Frankenstein creation of brass and thread, but it will serve its vital purpose for another few months. You set the repaired footwear back beside its partner, the heavy leather thudding softly against the floorboards. Your hands are coated in a sticky layer of wax and soot, requiring a harsh scrubbing with lye soap that will have to wait until morning. You feel the hours drag forward with agonizing slowness, the relentless ticking of the clock serving as the only marker of passing time in the sealed farmhouse. The storm shows no sign of abating, the wind maintaining its terrifying velocity and hammering the structure with an unending barrage of ice and snow. The frost on the windows has grown half an inch thick, a solid, impenetrable wall of white that blocks out any possibility of moonlight. The isolation is complete, severing the farm from the rest of the world as effectively as if the entire property had been launched into the void. The fire in the stove requires another heavy log, the voracious flames consuming the hardwood faster than anticipated in the bitter cold. The supply in the wood box is dangerously low, a stark reality that will force another terrifying trip into the blizzard before dawn. You wrap the buffalo coat tighter around your body, the immense weight of the hide pressing down like a heavy, comforting blanket. Your eyes trace the familiar cracks in the ceiling plaster, recognizing the shape of a map you have studied for countless long nights. You refuse to let your mind wander toward the empty side of the bed in the other room, keeping your thoughts rigidly focused on the immediate physical sensations of the kitchen. The dry heat of the stove, the smell of the beeswax, the rough texture of the fur. These are the anchors that keep you tethered to the present. You listen to the wind, attempting to decipher the subtle changes in pitch that might indicate a lessening of the gale. The storm continues its assault, forcing you to simply endure the long, dark hours until the gray light of morning finally breaks the siege. A sudden sharp crack echoes from the rafters above, the sound of freezing timber contracting with sudden force under the plunging temperatures. The noise is loud enough to rival a pistol shot, startling the heavy silence of the kitchen and sending a fresh spike of adrenaline through your exhausted veins. The farmhouse groans in the aftermath, a long, drawn-out creak that travels down the load-bearing walls and settles heavy into the stone foundation. The wood is fighting its own battle against the cold, shrinking and warping as the moisture freezes deep within the grain. The structural integrity holds, but the continuous complaining of the house adds a layer of nerve-wracking tension to the already oppressive atmosphere. You stare at the ceiling, watching for any sign of shifting plaster or bowing beams in the dim, unsteady light. You let out a long, slow breath, watching the faint cloud of vapor materialize in the freezing air just a few feet from the stove. The reality of the 1880 winter is harsh and unforgiving, a daily test of endurance that strips away everything but the primal need to survive. You reach out and place your calloused hand against the warm iron of the stove, drawing the heat directly into your palm. The fire inside continues to burn, a small, stubborn defiance against the massive, frozen void pressing in from all sides. You will remain in this chair, feeding the flames and mending the tears, holding the line until the storm finally exhausts its fury. The night is far from over, but your resolve remains as solid and unyielding as the frozen earth beneath the floorboards. You rise from the rocking chair, the buffalo coat heavy on your shoulders. The fire requires no more tending for the moment, leaving you adrift in the dim kitchen. The howling wind has finally begun to lose its sharpest edge, settling into a low, sustained moan against the eaves. You pick up the kerosene lamp, turning the brass wheel just enough to cast a meager circle of yellow light across the floorboards. Shadows stretch and contort along the plaster walls, following your slow procession toward the back of the house. The temperature drops noticeably the further you step from the iron stove, biting through the thick wool of your skirt. A narrow hallway leads to the small bedroom where the youngest member of the household rests. You push the wooden door open, the iron hinges groaning softly in the absolute quiet. The air inside is frigid, a stark contrast to the heavy layers of quilts piled high on the narrow rope bed. You lift the lamp slightly, the faint glow revealing a small face framed by the thick, colorful patchwork. The child breathes in a steady, rhythmic cadence, a sound that grounds you more firmly than the ticking clock. You pull the top quilt higher, tucking the edges tightly against the mattress to seal out the creeping frost. The memory of the afternoon resurfaces unbidden, sharp and stinging in the stillness of the room. You recall the small, trusting eyes looking up from the kitchen table, asking the question you had dreaded for weeks. Explaining the permanence of loss to a young mind felt like lifting a boulder with exhausted arms. You had crouched down to eye level, your joints popping in the quiet kitchen, searching for words that would not shatter the fragile world. You spoke of distant places and accidents of the frontier, avoiding the harsh reality of the sudden ambush on the trading trail. The tears that followed were inevitable, a small storm of confusion that you weathered by rocking the trembling body until exhaustion claimed them. You step back into the hallway, the lamp swaying slightly in your trembling hand. The silence of the house presses against your eardrums, a physical weight that threatens to buckle your knees. You carry the light toward your own bedroom, the space that feels too vast and echoing for a single occupant. A large cedar trunk sits at the foot of the heavy oak bedstead, its iron clasps cool to the touch. You kneel on the braided rug, setting the lamp carefully on the floorboards before undoing the heavy latches. The lid protests with a loud squeak, releasing the rich, spicy scent of cedar mixed with the unmistakable aroma of worn leather and lye soap. You reach into the depths of the trunk, your fingers brushing against folded linens before finding the rough wool of his Sunday coat. The fabric feels exactly as you remember, stiff at the collar and worn soft around the cuffs. You pull the heavy garment onto your lap, burying your face in the dark material without giving yourself time to reconsider. The scent is faint, but undeniably his, a mixture of tobacco, horse sweat, and the pine soap he favored. A ragged breath escapes your lips, the sound echoing harshly in the desolate room. You grip the sleeves tightly, fighting the urge to collapse onto the floorboards and surrender to the crushing wave of sorrow. A small tin box rests in the corner of the trunk, holding the sparse physical remnants of a life cut short. You pry the tight lid off, revealing the pocket watch that ceased ticking on the day he fell. The brass casing is scratched, the glass face shattered by whatever force took him from the world. Beside it lies his plain silver wedding band, returned by the scout who brought the terrible news. You pick up the ring, the metal cold and unyielding against the calloused skin of your palm. This tiny circle of silver represents vows spoken in a crowded pioneer church, promises that were meant to span decades rather than a few fleeting seasons. You trace the edge of the watch, the metallic texture cold against your thumb. The scout had stood on your porch just a month prior, twisting his battered hat in his hands while delivering the fatal blow. He spoke in low, halting tones, describing an act of bravery that cost your husband his life while saving 2 others. You had stood in the doorway listening to the horrific details while the world around you dissolved into static. The young man wept openly, burdened by a guilt that you could not alleviate, no matter how many soft words you offered. You thanked him for the terrible truth, understanding that carrying the story back to the frontier was its own cruel duty. You returned the watch and ring to the tin box, closing the lid with a decisive snap. The physical artifacts offer no true comfort, only a stark confirmation of the permanent absence haunting the farmhouse. You fold the wool coat with meticulous care, smoothing the wrinkles before placing it back into the cedar depths. The heavy wooden lid falls shut, sealing the memories away for another night. You pick up the kerosene lamp, the glass chimney warm against your chilled fingers. The bedroom remains an icy cavern, offering no solace or rest for a mind trapped in a cycle of grief and endurance. You walk back toward the kitchen, the pool of light guiding your steps through the freezing corridor. The stove has maintained its steady heat, a beacon of life in the center of the dark house. You set the lamp on the wooden table, the yellow glow illuminating the stack of official documents resting near the edge. The frontier bureaucracy demands attention, even in the midst of a blinding winter storm. You pull a chair out, the legs scraping loudly against the planks, and sit down to face the daunting pile of paperwork. Proving ownership of the land requires signatures, seals, and a stoic endurance that drains your remaining energy. You unfold a stiff piece of parchment, the deed to the property bearing both of your names in fading ink. The local magistrate requires a formal declaration of your status, a cruel necessity for a widow claiming sole proprietorship. You dip a steel pen into the inkwell, the dark liquid pooling on the nib with a sinister gleam. Writing your signature on the designated line feels like a betrayal, a final, legal acknowledgement of the tragedy. You press the pen to the paper, forming the letters with slow, deliberate strokes. The ink dries quickly in the dry heat of the stove, solidifying your solitary claim to the unforgiving acreage. You push the stack of documents aside, the bureaucratic burden lifted temporarily from your weary shoulders. A small wooden music box sits on the shelf above the pantry, a luxury item purchased during a rare trip to the mercantile. You reach up and carefully bring it down to the table, wiping a thin layer of dust from the polished mahogany lid. The tiny brass crank offers resistance as you turn it, winding the delicate internal spring tight. A metallic tinny melody chimes into the quiet room, a cheerful waltz that clashes jarringly with the somber atmosphere. You listen to the fragile notes, remembering the barn dance where you first heard the tune played by a sweating fiddler. You watch the small brass cylinder turn, the tiny pins plucking the metal comb to produce the lively song. The memory of that summer evening feels like a transmission from a different lifetime, a world filled with warmth, laughter, and unbroken promises. You had danced until your feet blistered, spinning across the rough floorboards while the music swelled around you. Now the same melody highlights the cavernous emptiness of the kitchen, underscoring the silence that has become your constant companion. The music box winds down, the notes slowing until they stop altogether, leaving the room quieter than before. You return the mahogany box to its shelf, locking the melody away with the rest of the unreachable past. You walk to the frosted window, pressing your palm flat against the icy glass. The heat from your hand melts a small, ragged circle in the crystalline buildup, offering a narrow view of the chaotic night. The snow continues to fall in thick, swirling sheets, burying the fence posts and erasing all familiar landmarks. The general store sits 5 miles away, a hub of community life that feels as distant as the moon. You picture the small mail slot behind the wooden counter, the place where you still instinctively hope to find a delayed letter. The logical part of your mind knows the box will remain empty, but the irrational hope persists, a stubborn weed refusing to die. You step away from the window, the cold from the glass lingering on your skin. The women of the nearest settlement have formed a quiet network of support, a silent sisterhood bound by shared loss. You remember the faces of the other widows in the pews at church, their eyes carrying the same hollow endurance that you see in your own reflection. They drop off extra loaves of bread or stay to help mend a torn harness, offering practical assistance without the burden of pity. This unspoken camaraderie provides a fragile safety net, a reminder that you are not truly alone in the struggle against the frontier. You lean against the counter, drawing strength from the memory of their steady, calloused hands. You check the water bucket near the stove, finding a thin layer of ice already forming across the surface. The fire requires another piece of wood, the voracious flames demanding constant sacrifice to keep the deadly cold at bay. You lift the iron poker, stirring the glowing embers until they flare into an angry bright red. A heavy knot of oak goes into the firebox, the dense wood promising a slow, sustained burn for the remaining hours of the night. You wipe your hands on your apron, the coarse fabric absorbing the soot and sweat of the ongoing battle. The kitchen reclaims a fraction of its warmth, a small, hard-won victory in the endless war against the winter. You return to the rocking chair, pulling the buffalo coat tight around your shivering frame. The mantle clock ticks relentlessly, slicing the deep night into precise, mechanical fragments. The physical exhaustion deepens, a heavy weight that pulls at your eyelids and dulls your racing thoughts. You stare into the flickering light slipping through the stove door, letting the hypnotic dance of the flames quiet your mind. The farm stands firm against the blizzard. The animals rest securely in the barn, and you have survived another agonizing rotation of the clock. You will not close your eyes yet, maintaining the necessary vigil until the gray light of dawn signals the end of the siege. You retrieve a small sack of dried apples from the pantry, the shriveled fruit offering a tart, concentrated burst of flavor. Chewing the tough flesh requires effort, a repetitive jaw motion that keeps the creeping lethargy at bay. The sweetness is a sharp contrast to the salty, savory notes of the evening meal, a tiny luxury preserved from the fleeting autumn harvest. You savor the meager treat, letting the taste transport you back to the bustling orchard where wooden ladders leaned against heavy branches. The contrast between that vibrant, sunlit memory and the current frozen isolation is jarring, yet you hold on to the image as a shield against the dark. You adjust the collar of the buffalo coat, ensuring the thick fur covers the sensitive skin at the nape of your neck. The wind outside shifts once more, striking the eastern wall with a renewed shrieking intensity that rattles the iron latches. You remain seated, an immovable object anchored to the rocking chair by duty and sheer stubbornness. The house continues its chorus of groans and creaks, a wooden ship navigating the treacherous, frozen ocean. You keep your gaze fixed on the glowing seams of the stove door, trusting the iron to hold the fire and the dawn to eventually break. You stand up from the rocking chair, the stiff buffalo hide resisting your movement like a heavy, frozen shell. The fire requires no more fuel for the moment, but the drastic drop in temperature warns of unseen dangers lurking beyond the hearth. The root cellar sits directly beneath the kitchen floorboards, a dark cavity packed with the fragile summer harvest that sustains the household. Freezing temperatures down there would mean starvation long before the spring thaw arrives to soften the iron-hard earth. You let the iron rings set into the trapdoor, feeling the immediate stubborn resistance of the swollen wood against your raw hands. Heaving it upward requires a sharp, sudden pull that sends a jolt of dull pain straight up your forearm to your shoulder. Musty air rises from the square opening, carrying the distinct, earthy scent of damp soil and aging potatoes. The lantern light barely penetrates the gloom of the hand-dug basement, illuminating rough stone walls slick with frozen condensation. You descend the steep wooden stairs cautiously, your heavy leather boots protesting loudly against the narrow, uneven treads. The cold down here differs from the biting wind outside. It is a heavy, stagnant chill that settles directly into the lungs. Rows of glass, mason jars line the crude wooden shelves, their metal lids reflecting the weak yellow light like tarnished coins. These preserved tomatoes, green beans, and spiced peaches represent countless hours of sweltering summer labor over a boiling stove. You pull the thick wool shawl tighter across your chest, feeling the dampness of the cellar air clinging to the coarse fibers. Inspecting the jars requires a slow, deliberate walk down the cramped aisle, checking for the telltale bulge of a shattered, frozen container. A single cracked jar of pickled beets would spoil the surrounding provisions, a minor disaster in an already precarious existence. You tap the glass sides with a numb knuckle, listening for the solid, dull thud of frozen liquid instead of the preferred hollow ring. The peaches glow like captive sunlight within their thick syrup, a cruel reminder of warmer days that feel wholly fictional tonight. Finding the inventory intact brings a sharp, fleeting sense of relief that temporarily lightens the crushing weight resting on your tired shoulders. Shadows dance wildly across the packed dirt floor as the lantern swings from the brass ring hooked over your finger. A large wooden bin sits in the farthest corner, holding the vital supply of seed potatoes buried under thick layers of dry straw. You kneel beside the rough-hewn planks, digging through the prickly bedding to unearth the wrinkled tubers sprouting pale, fragile eyes. The earthy smell of the potatoes provides a grounding sensation, a tangible connection to the soil currently locked beneath feet of ice. You turn several potatoes over in your hands, checking for the soft, spongy spots that indicate rot has taken hold in the damp dark. The skins remain firm and dry, promising a strong yield if the weather ever relents long enough for proper spring planting. You climb back up the steep staircase, the heavy trap door falling shut with a resonant, booming slam that echoes through the empty kitchen. The radiant heat from the cast iron stove acts like a physical embrace after the stagnant, freezing air of the root cellar. You set the lantern back on the table, noticing the fine layer of black soot collecting on the inside of the glass chimney. Outside, the storm seems to have found a second wind, battering the eastern wall with a renewed, shrieking ferocity that rattles the remaining teacups in the wooden cupboard. You press the heels of your hands against your tired eyes, rubbing away the grit and the burning sensation of prolonged exhaustion. Rest remains an impossible luxury, a dangerous vulnerability when the fire demands constant, unwavering vigilance to keep the frost at bay. Midnight has long passed, leaving the farmhouse adrift in the bleak, uncharted territory of the deepest night hours. The brass pendulum of the mantel clock continues its monotonous slicing of time, each tick acting as a small hammer striking against the oppressive silence. You retrieve a worn copy of a farmer's almanac from the shelf, its pages brittle and yellowed from years of constant consultation by the hearth. The astrological charts and weather predictions offer little true comfort, but the familiar columns of text provide a necessary distraction from the howling gale. You trace the phases of the moon with a callous index finger, noting that tonight should have been illuminated by a bright, waxing crescent. Instead, the world is locked in a blinding, chaotic whiteout that erases all celestial navigation and isolates the farm completely. You run a hand over the worn, embossed leather cover of the almanac, feeling the intricate patterns pressed deep into the binding. The book belonged to his father before passing into his hands, a generational tool utilized for deciphering the brutal whims of the frontier environment. He used to read the weather lore aloud by the fire, his voice carrying a mix of reverence and skepticism for the old pioneer superstitions. You close the book gently, unwilling to let the memory paralyze your hands while there is still vital work to be done. The tin coffee pot sitting on the back of the stove has boiled dry, the chicory ground scorched into a hard, blackened crust against the bottom. Scrubbing the ruined metal will require boiling water and coarse sand, adding another tedious chore to the morning's endless list of demands. Moving toward the washstand, you pour a small amount of tepid water from the ceramic pitcher into the matching basin. The harsh lye soap stings the tiny cuts and abrasions covering your knuckles, producing a sharp, cleansing pain that sharpens your dulling senses. You wash the soot and potato dirt from your hands, watching the murky water swirl slowly around the metal drain hole. Drying your fingers on a rough linen towel, you catch your reflection in the small, clouded mirror hanging crookedly on the plaster wall. The face staring back is pale and drawn, the eyes shadowed with an immense weariness that reaches far beyond simple physical fatigue. You look away quickly, refusing to acknowledge the severe toll the winter is extracting from your enduring spirit. You walk softly down the narrow hallway again, the floorboards groaning in loud protest beneath your heavy leather boots. The cold in the corridor bites with a sharp intensity, piercing through the thick buffalo hide and raising goosebumps along your bare arms. You pause outside the child's bedroom, pressing your ear to the cold, rough grain of the heavy wooden door. The soft, rhythmic breathing continues undisturbed, a fragile thread of life persisting amidst the crushing pressure of the winter blizzard. You do not open the door this time, fearing the sudden influx of freezing draft might disrupt the deep, necessary slumber occurring within. Standing in the dark hallway, you offer a silent, desperate hope to the empty air, asking only for the morning to arrive without further tragedy. Returning to the kitchen, your gaze falls upon a heavy cast iron skillet hanging from a wrought iron hook near the stove. The metal surface has begun to dull, losing the slick black sheen that prevents food from sticking and rust from forming in the damp air. You pull the heavy pan down, its weight a familiar strain on your wrists, and set it squarely on the warm stovetop. A small tin of rendered bacon fat sits in the pantry, its white solid contents essential for maintaining the heavy cookware. You scoop a generous portion of the grease onto a folded piece of muslin, preparing to work the protective layer into the porous iron. The maintenance of tools is an ongoing sacred duty on the frontier, a necessary line of defense against the relentless decay of the elements. You rub the fat into the warm iron using tight circular motions, watching the metal drink in the grease and darken to a rich, glossy black. The smell of the rendered bacon fills the kitchen, a savory, heavy aroma that triggers a sharp pang of hunger in your empty stomach. You ignore the craving, focusing wholly on coating every inch of the skillet, including the handle and the rough exterior walls. The repetitive physical action acts as a balm to your frayed nerves, providing a concrete, manageable task in a world that feels dangerously out of control. You wipe away the excess grease with a clean rag, holding the revitalized pan up to the lamplight to inspect the smooth, uniform finish. The skillet is hung back on its hook, ready to fry the morning oats whenever the sun decides to finally rise over the valley. Outside, the gale reaches a new, terrifying crescendo, striking the farmhouse with a sustained blast that forces a fine mist of snow through the window casings. The temperature in the kitchen plummets instantly, fighting back the radiant heat of the stove and reclaiming the far edges of the room. You rush to the wood box, grabbing 3 large pieces of split oak and shoving them into the roaring firebox without hesitation. The flames leap greedily at the fresh fuel, roaring up the brick chimney with a sound resembling a rushing, violent waterfall. You pull the rocking chair dangerously close to the hot iron, wrapping the buffalo coat tightly around your shivering, exhausted frame. The storm is demanding your full attention now, testing the limits of the shelter and the boundaries of your own physical endurance. You sit rigid in the chair, your eyes fixed on the glowing seams of the stove door, listening to the house scream under the wind's massive assault. The structural timbers groan and pop, the sounds echoing like rifle shots in the tense, freezing air of the confined space. You calculate the remaining hours until dawn, the mental math offering no comfort as the night stretches endlessly before you. A sudden, sharp crack sounds from the direction of the barn, a noise distinctly different from the shifting of the farmhouse. You grip the wooden armrest of the rocking chair, your heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against your aching ribs. Investigating the sound would require venturing back into the lethal whiteout, a risk that borders on suicidal in the current blizzard conditions. Silence follows the ominous crack, a heavy, suffocating stillness that seems to magnify the subsequent roaring of the wind. You strain your ears, trying to isolate any further sounds of structural failure from the outbuildings, but the gale drowns out all other frequencies. The animals are locked tight, the heavy iron bars drop securely into place. But a collapsed roof would spell certain disaster for the trapped livestock. You stand up, your legs trembling slightly from the adrenaline surging through your veins, and pace the short distance between the stove and the door. The buffalo coat feels suffocating now, trapping the nervous heat radiating outward from your own tense body. You force yourself to sit back down, knowing that stepping blindly into the storm would guarantee your own demise, leaving the child utterly defenseless. You close your eyes and focus on the slow, deliberate intake of breath, forcing your racing heart rate to steady and slow. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford. It clouds rational judgment and leads to fatal mistakes in the harsh frontier environment. You run through the mental checklist of the barn's construction, recalling the thick, load-bearing beams he had installed precisely to withstand the weight of winter snows. The structure is solid, built by hands that understood the unforgiving, brutal nature of the isolated valley. You cling to that knowledge, using it as an anchor against the rising tide of fear threatening to overwhelm your logical reason. The barn will hold, the animals will survive, and you will remain in this chair until the gray light returns. Abandoned earlier in the evening, a small pile of mending still sits on the table, waiting for the attention you could not previously provide. You reach for a heavy woolen mitten, its thumb worn through from the constant friction of chopping wood and hauling well water. The bone needle feels clumsy in your stiff fingers, the thick waxed thread resisting the pull through the dense matted fabric. You force the needle through the wool, weaving a tight, ugly patch over the gaping hole, prioritizing function over any desire for aesthetic appeal. The repetitive motion gives your nervous hands something to do, a productive outlet for the anxious energy vibrating just under your skin. The mitten is rough and misshapen when finished, but it will prevent frostbite during the inevitable grueling morning chores. You set the mended mitten aside, your fingers aching fiercely from the effort of pushing the needle through the heavy, resistant wool. The kerosene lamp flickers wildly as a strong draft snakes across the floorboards, threatening to extinguish the fragile yellow flame. You cup your hand around the glass chimney, shielding the light until the wind shifts and the icy draft finally subsides. The reservoir is dangerously low, the clear liquid barely covering the bottom of the glass bowl, signaling an impending plunge into darkness. Refilling it requires a trip to the freezing pantry, where the large metal canister of kerosene sits waiting on the bottom shelf. You grab the lamp by its wire handle, the metal warm against your palm, and walk steadily toward the storage room. Scents of dried onions, bundled herbs, and the sharp chemical odor of lamp oil fill the cramped pantry as you enter. You set the lamp on a low wooden shelf, uncapping the heavy metal canister with the sharp, forceful twist of your wrist. Pouring the kerosene requires a steady hand, a difficult feat when your muscles are shivering from the biting cold of the unheated room. The clear liquid glugs into the glass reservoir, filling the bowl to the brim and soaking the thick cotton wick. You screw the brass burner back into place, the metal threads squeaking sharply in the quiet, isolated space. The lamp burns brighter instantly, the fresh fuel pushing back the encroaching shadows and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. You carry the revitalized light back to the kitchen table, feeling a small sense of accomplishment in completing the simple, necessary task. The clock strikes three sharp ringing chimes that announce the deepest, most desolate hour of the long winter night. The temperature has reached its lowest point, a crushing, suffocating cold that seeks to freeze the blood moving sluggishly in your veins. You pile another log into the stove, ignoring the dwindling supply in the wood box, knowing that surviving the next few hours requires maximum heat. You pull the buffalo coat tighter, burying your chin in the thick fur, and prepare to face the final agonizing stretch of darkness before the dawn. The wind outside the frosted window panes undergoes a subtle transformation during the fourth hour of the morning, dropping its high-pitched shriek for a lower, more hollow rumble. You tilt your head toward the wooden ceiling, listening as the massive timber beams stop their frantic groaning and settle into a sustained, heavy tension. This shift signals the eye of the blizzard, or perhaps its final, dying breath, leaving an eerie, expectant quiet in its wake that feels almost as oppressive as the chaos. The sudden lack of violent noise makes the ticking of the mantel clock sound unnaturally loud, each mechanical strike echoing like a hammer blow against an anvil. You shift your weight in the rocking chair, the buffalo coat rustling heavily against the wooden spindles as your stiff muscles protest the prolonged period of anxious stillness. You rise slowly and walk toward the tall wooden cabinet standing in the shadowed corner near the pantry door, its glass front reflecting the dim yellow lamplight. A heavy Winchester repeating rifle rests inside, its walnut stock gleaming dulled and neglected since the early days of autumn. The frontier demands preparedness, and a weapon left to rust in the damp winter air becomes a useless liability when predators are driven mad by starvation. You pull the heavy firearm from its wooden cradle, the cold steel of the barrel shocking your bare hands with a sudden sharp bite. Carrying the long gun back to the kitchen table feels distinctly unnatural now, a stark reminder of the protective duties that have suddenly fallen entirely upon your exhausted shoulders. A small tin of specialized gun oil and a bundle of clean flannel patches reside in a wooden cigar box on the highest shelf of the dresser. You spread a thick piece of canvas across the table planks, laying the heavy rifle down carefully before dipping a metal cleaning rod into the pungent liquid. The smell of the solvent is sharp and chemical, clearing the lingering scent of wood smoke from your nostrils with an almost medicinal intensity. You push the oiled flannel down the length of the steel barrel, feeling the gritty resistance of old powder residue giving way to smooth, polished metal. This mechanical task requires precise attention, forcing your mind away from the empty silence of the farmhouse and centering it entirely on the physical friction of brass against steel. Your shoulders burn with a deep, radiating ache as you work the cleaning rod back and forth, the muscles screaming from the accumulated labor of hauling wood and carrying water. A small, dark amber bottle of camphor liniment sits on the windowsill, its cork stopper sealed tight against the dry heat of the iron stove. You set the rifle parts aside momentarily, uncorking the glass bottle to release a powerful, eye-watering scent of wintergreen and eucalyptus into the warm kitchen air. Pouring a small pool of the thick liquid into your palm, you massage the burning ointment deep into the joints of your hands and wrists. The chemical heat bites into your skin immediately, creating a strange, dual sensation of soothing warmth and sharp irritation that temporarily masks the deeper muscular exhaustion. You wipe your hands clean on a rough rag before returning to the disassembled rifle, ensuring no stray lint or corrosive sweat contaminates the delicate internal mechanisms. The lever action slides open with a sharp, satisfying metallic clack, the machine steel parts engaging with a precision that defies the chaotic wilderness outside the walls. You apply a single drop of oil to the primary spring, watching the amber liquid seep into the microscopic crevices of the metal before wiping away the excess. Maintaining this tool represents a tangible assertion of control, a physical declaration that you refuse to become a passive victim of the brutal 1880 frontier. You reassemble the weapon swiftly, the heavy click of the locking mechanism echoing firmly through the quiet, isolated room. The iron stove demands another sacrifice before the true morning chores can commence, its radiant heat having dwindled during the meticulous rifle maintenance. You open the heavy cast iron door, tossing 3 smaller pieces of split birch onto the glowing red coals to create a quick, intense flare of heat necessary for baking. A massive wooden dough bowl sits on the lower shelf of the pantry, bearing the deep, smooth grooves carved by decades of aggressive kneading. You haul the heavy wooden vessel onto the table, the flat bottom thudding dully against the planks before you reach for the heavy canvas sack of milled wheat flour. The fine, powdery dust billows up as you scoop it into the bowl, coating your forearms and the dark wool of your sleeves in a thin layer of stark white. A small ceramic crock holds the precious sourdough starter, a living culture of wild yeast that has survived the freezing temperatures by resting precariously close to the stove. You unseal the lid, inhaling the sharp, fermented tang of the bubbling batter before pouring the generous measure into the waiting mountain of flour. Tepid water from the iron kettle joins the mixture, the liquid turning cloudy as it binds the dry ingredients into a shaggy, uncooperative mass. You plunge your bare hands into the bowl, the wet dough instantly clinging to your fingers like a heavy cold paste that resists every attempt at smooth integration. The physical exertion required to fold and press the thick mixture quickly raises your heart rate, providing a necessary surge of internal heat that pushes back the lingering chill of the room. You turn the heavy dough out onto the floured table boards, leaning your entire body weight into the heels of your hands to stretch the stubborn gluten fibers. The rhythmic motion of pushing, folding, and turning becomes a moving meditation, a silent chant of survival repeated against the backdrop of the dying blizzard. Your breath comes in measured, shallow bursts as you wrestle the expanding mound of flour and water into a smooth, elastic sphere that snaps back slightly when prodded. The scent of raw yeast and toasted grain fills the immediate area, a deeply comforting, ancient aroma that signifies life and sustenance in the midst of barren winter. You place the smooth dough back into the wooden bowl, covering it with a damp linen cloth to protect the fragile surface from the drying heat of the nearby stove. Silence outside the window deepens abruptly, the low moan of the wind cutting off as if severed by a massive, invisible blade. You pause your cleanup, your hands hovering over the floured table, listening intensely to the sudden, overwhelming absence of atmospheric violence. The blizzard has finally exhausted its fury, leaving the isolated farmhouse marooned in a sea of absolute, breathtaking stillness that feels heavier than the storm itself. You walk slowly toward the frosted glass, wiping a larger circle clear with the edge of your sleeve to peer out into the frozen, transformed landscape. The sky remains a pitch-black void, but the chaotic swirling of white has ceased, replaced by a profound, motionless freeze that locks the entire valley in a state of suspended animation. This sudden quiet is not peaceful. It is a heavy, expectant void that amplifies the internal noise of your own racing thoughts and painful memories. When the wind was howling, the noise provided a necessary distraction, a chaotic opponent that required all your mental fortitude to withstand. Now, the absolute stillness leaves too much room for the ghosts to wander the hallways, their invisible footsteps echoing in the cavernous emptiness of the house. You step away from the window, the cold from the glass clinging to your skin, and return to the immediate warmth of the iron stove. Finding another task becomes desperately important, a frantic search for any physical labor that can drown out the deafening roar of the memories threatening to break surface. A pair of heavy flat irons sits on the bottom shelf of the washstand, their wedge-shaped bases cold and dormant since the previous week's laundering. You carry them to the stove, setting the thick metal plates directly onto the hottest iron surface to absorb the intense heat necessary for pressing heavy fabrics. The smell of scorching dust rises immediately, a sharp, burnt odor that singes the inside of your nose and causes your eyes to water faintly. You pull a thick, padded ironing board from its resting place behind the pantry door, setting it securely across the backs of 2 sturdy wooden chairs. The frozen laundry brought in earlier hangs limply over drying racks near the fire, the damp wool and cotton now completely thawed but deeply wrinkled from the harsh freezing process. You test the heat of the first iron by flicking a single drop of water from your fingertip onto the flat metal surface, listening for the sharp, instantaneous hiss that signals readiness. Gripping the thick wooden handle with a padded rag, You slide the heavy searing wedge across a wrinkled cotton shirt, leaving a perfectly smooth, steaming trail in its wake. The physical weight of the iron requires strong, deliberate thrusts of the shoulder, pressing the wrinkles flat with a combination of extreme heat and sheer mechanical force. The steam rises in thick, humid clouds, carrying the clean, sharp scent of lye soap and creating a localized pocket of intense, sweltering heat around the makeshift board. You swap the cooling iron for its blistering counterpart on the stove, maintaining a steady, unbroken rhythm that keeps the creeping despair at bay. The mechanical repetition of the pressing allows your mind to detach slightly, hovering in a numb, liminal space between the physical labor and the emotional exhaustion. You watch the wrinkles vanish beneath the hot iron, wishing foolishly that the deep, jagged creases in your own life could be smoothed out with such simple, direct application of force. The shirt belongs to your child, the small dimensions requiring careful maneuvering of the heavy iron around delicate bone buttons and narrow collars. You fold the warm, perfectly pressed garment with meticulous precision, stacking it neatly on the edge of the table before reaching for the next crumpled piece of fabric. The stack of finished laundry grows slowly, a tangible monument to your stubborn refusal to let the standards of the household slip into the chaos of grief. You set the cooling iron back on the stove, wiping the sweat from your forehead with the back of a flour-dusted wrist. The dough resting in the wooden bowl has begun its slow, miraculous expansion, the pale surface rising steadily beneath the damp linen cloth. The living yeast feeds on the warmth of the room, multiplying and exhaling invisible gases that transform the dense paste into a light, airy structure capable of sustaining life. You press 2 fingers gently into the surface, watching the small indentations hold their shape perfectly, indicating that the fragile gluten network is ready for the final shaping. This transformation feels like a quiet defiance against the deathly freeze outside, a small contained miracle of growth occurring in the dead of winter. You divide the massive mound of dough into 3 equal portions, using a sharp steel bench scraper to sever the sticky, elastic strands. The air bubbles pop softly under the pressure of your hands as you fold the edges of the dough underneath itself, creating a smooth, taut surface on each rounded loaf. The tactile sensation of the warm, supple dough provides a deeply grounding comfort, a reminder of the soft, yielding textures that still exist in this harsh, unforgiving environment. You place the shaped spheres into greased cast iron baking pans, the dark metal contrasting sharply with the pale, floured surface of the raw bread. The pans are set on a wooden board near the stove for their final, crucial rise before the intense heat of the oven transforms them permanently. The mantel clock strikes 4. The brass chimes echoing with a lonely, hollow resonance to the impossibly quiet farmhouse. You stand at the center of the kitchen, surrounded by the quiet evidence of your relentless labor, the oiled rifle, the pressed laundry, the rising bread. Your body aches with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, every muscle throbbing in dull synchronization with the beating of your heart. Yet the absolute terror of the early evening has faded, replaced by a grim, unyielding determination to see the sunrise over the frozen valley once more. You pull the buffalo coat securely around your shoulders, ready to face the final silent hours of the pre-dawn darkness with a hardened, unbroken spirit. The floorboards near the door bear the messy evidence of the night's frantic excursions, a chaotic smattering of dried mud, melted snow, and scattered wood chips. You retrieve a heavy, bristled scrubbing brush and a wooden bucket from the washroom, filling the container with hot water from the reservoir attached to the side of the iron stove. A splash of harsh vinegar is added to the water, the sharp acidic smell immediately overwhelming the warm, yeasty aroma of the rising bread. You drop to your knees on the hard planks, ignoring the sharp spike of pain shooting through your joints as you plunge the coarse brush into the steaming, pungent liquid. Scrubbing the floor requires aggressive, sweeping motions, the stiff bristles digging deep into the grain of the wood to dislodge the stubborn, frozen dirt. Hot water turns murky almost instantly, reflecting the grim reality of tracking the frontier wilderness into the fragile sanctuary of the home. You lean your entire upper body into the brush, forcing the bristles to scrape away the hardened mud with a loud, abrasive rasping sound that echoes harshly in the still room. Your breath comes in ragged gasps, the physical exertion sending a fresh wave of sweat trickling down the back of your neck despite the ambient chill of the floor drafts. The vinegar stings the microabrasions on your knuckles, a biting reminder of the constant friction your skin endures on a daily basis. You wipe away the dirty water with a heavy linen rag, leaving a clean, damp stretch of wood that quickly begins to freeze at the edges nearest the uninsulated door. You stand up slowly, your knees cracking loudly in the silent house, and carry the filthy bucket back to the washroom to be dealt with later. The heavy leather boots you wore during the storm sit in a puddle of their own melted ice, the tough hide looking dull, saturated, and dangerously close to cracking. You cannot afford to let the essential footwear rot, so you grab a tin of hardened tallow and a small, stiff-bristled dauber from the shelf above the sink. Sitting heavily on the edge of a wooden chair, you pull the damp boot onto your lap, the cold leather seeping immediately through the thick wool of your skirt. You work the greasy tallow into the seams and welt, applying heavy pressure to force the waterproofing agent deep into the porous, waterlogged hide. The smell of the rendered animal fat is thick and slightly rancid, a brutal, primitive odor that speaks to the unglamorous realities of surviving an 880 winter. Your thumb aches as you rub the tallow into the toe box, smoothing out the deep creases caused by miles of frantic walking through heavy, resistant snowdrifts. The leather slowly regains a dull, greasy sheen, repelling the remaining moisture and regaining a fraction of its necessary suppleness. You switch to the second boot, repeating the tedious, messy process with a mechanical efficiency that leaves no room for despair. The finished boots are set far enough from the stove to avoid scorching the leather, but close enough to allow the radiant heat to slowly melt the tallow deep into the fibers. The kitchen now smells of vinegar, tallow, wood smoke, and yeast, a complex, overwhelming bouquet that perfectly encapsulates the relentless domestic industry of the frontier. You wash your greasy hands in the remaining warm water of the basin, scrubbing furiously with the lye soap until the skin feels raw and completely stripped of oils. Drying your hands on the rough towel, you look around the dimly lit room, noting that every immediate crisis has been managed, delayed, or subdued through sheer force of will. The terrible, oppressive stillness of the post-blizzard night presses against the windows, a silent, frozen wasteland waiting to be faced when the sun finally decides to return. You pull the buffalo coat tighter, knowing that the pre-dawn hours are always the coldest, the darkest, and the most unforgiving test of human endurance. You sit motionless in the heavy buffalo coat, staring blankly at the dark cast-iron door of the stove. The suffocating silence of the isolated farmhouse brings forth vivid memories of the community's initial reaction to the devastating news. The neighbors from surrounding claims had arrived within hours of the scout departing the yard. They brought heavy iron pots filled with whatever meager provisions they could spare from their own winter stores. Dense loaves of rye bread and salted venison stews covered the kitchen table, an overwhelming display of frontier solidarity. The women of the valley carried the same grim, knowing expression on their weathered faces as they crossed your threshold. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones, offering practical labor instead of the empty, useless platitudes favored by town folks. Mrs. Miller had immediately taken the broom from your trembling hands, sweeping the floorboards with a fierce, determined energy. Their presence made the farmhouse feel suffocatingly crowded despite the vast, echoing emptiness left by his sudden absence. This silent sisterhood understood instinctively that surviving such a loss required immediate, communal intervention. You remember the awkward, stifling encounters at the mercantile during your first necessary trip into town weeks later. The shopkeeper and the local patrons treated you with a fragile, overly cautious demeanor that only amplified your alienation. Their eyes reflected a hidden pity mixed with an uncomfortable awareness of their own vulnerability to the harsh territory. They offered continuous, unsolicited advice regarding the management of the farm, speaking as if you were a helpless child. You absorbed their words with polite nods, calculating the exorbitant cost of winter wheat while ignoring their patronizing tones. Sunday church services presented a drastically different ordeal, an emotional gauntlet you forced yourself to run for the sake of appearances. The rough wooden pews offered no physical comfort, the sanctuary smelling heavily of damp wool, beeswax, and ancient hymnals. The preacher dedicated his fiery sermon to the noble, righteous sacrifices made by those lost to the unforgiving wilderness. Hearing his name invoked from the pulpit as a cautionary tale of bravery felt like a physical strike against your ribs. The public airing of your private tragedy left you feeling exposed and resentful beneath the stained glass windows. You uncrossed your ankles, feeling a sharp stiffness radiate through your freezing calves and up into your tired knees. The congregation expected a display of stoic, patriotic resilience, demanding you serve as a living monument to frontier endurance. You sat perfectly still during those grueling services, hands clasped so tightly your knuckles turned white against your dark skirt. Refusing to offer them the spectacle of a weeping, broken widow became a matter of fierce, uncompromising personal pride. The immense pressure to remain composed was a heavy burden placed upon your shoulders by people returning to warm, intact homes. A sudden, uninvited memory of a recent afternoon surfaces in the quiet kitchen, bringing a fresh, complicated wave of guilt. The child had tripped over a frozen bucket in the yard, tumbling into a snowbank and emerging covered in white powder. You had laughed aloud, a sudden bright ringing sound that echoed across the frozen property before you could suppress it. The joyous noise felt foreign and wrong, a betrayal of the somber atmosphere that had dominated the farm for months. The child smiled back, thrilled by the rare sound of your amusement, while your own heart twisted with immediate punishing regret. Guilt clamped around your throat, like an iron collar the second the laughter faded into the frigid winter air. You felt as though you had committed an unforgivable crime against his memory by finding a fleeting moment of happiness. The remainder of that bitter afternoon was spent in a severe, self-imposed silence, overcompensating for the brief lapse in mourning. You stare intently at the glowing embers now, wrestling with the impossible mathematics of grief and continued existence. The realization that he would have wanted you to laugh feels like a profound, heartbreaking truth you are not yet ready to accept. You trace the coarse grain of the wooden table with a calloused index finger, following the intricate swirling patterns in the oak. A solitary visitor had arrived just 3 days before the blizzard struck, a man who had ridden alongside him on the final trail. He stood awkwardly on your porch, twisting the brim of his battered felt hat, his face prematurely aged by wind and sun. You invited him into the kitchen, your stomach clenching with a terrifying, nauseating anticipation of the narrative he carried. The stranger accepted a cup of hot chicory, his hands trembling fiercely as the tin mug clattered against the wooden planks. The weary drover spoke in a low, halting cadence, staring fixedly into the fire rather than meeting your intense gaze. He described the treacherous mountain pass, the sudden, deafening roar of falling stone, and the chaotic, desperate scramble for survival. Your husband had not been caught unawares or paralyzed by fear. He had deliberately shoved the younger man out of the boulder's path. You listened to this brutal recounting with an eerie, detached calm, the heroic reality of his final seconds settling into your bones. The story confirmed everything you knew about his character, offering a terrible, beautiful pride that complicated your straightforward sorrow. Exhaustion settles heavy across your shoulders, a physical manifestation of the mental toll extracted by navigating these relentless memories. The drover had confessed his survivor's guilt, his voice cracking as he admitted he should have been the one crushed in the ravine. You offered him a quiet, steady absolution, assuring the broken man that the unpredictable cruelty of the territory operated without malice or reason. When he finally rode away from the farm, the true nature of the sacrifice transformed your raw grief into a hardened, agonizing strength. Carrying the knowledge of his courage acts as a hidden talisman, a secret reserve of fortitude when the isolation threatens to crush you. You adjust the collar of the heavy coat, burying your cold chin deep into the rough, animal-scented fur. The revelation of his bravery did not lessen the agonizing reality of his absence, nor did it warm the empty side of the bed. It simply changed the texture of the sorrow, adding a layer of nobility to a loss that had previously felt senseless and random. He chose to act with selfless instinct, putting another life before his own in a final, defining decision that mirrored his daily existence. You hold tightly to that fact, using it as a shield against the creeping bitterness that often poisons the minds of the bereaved. The brass clock strikes the half hour, a single sharp chime that slices through your introspective reverie like a physical blade. You stand up from the rocker, your joints popping loudly in the frigid air, and walk stiffly toward the dark pantry. Checking the status of the rising dough provides a necessary practical interruption to the overwhelming flood of historical reflection. The linen cloth has domed noticeably, the wild yeast continuing its microscopic, determined work despite the overwhelming cold surrounding the kitchen. You press a thumb gently into the pale surface, confirming the resilient, spongy texture that promises a successful, life-sustaining bake. You move back to the iron stove, adding the last few pitiful scraps of kindling to the firebox to maintain the critical baking temperature. The wood box is now virtually empty, presenting a dire immediate problem that must be solved the moment the sun breaches the horizon. You prepare mentally for the grueling, terrifying task of excavating the buried woodpile from beneath feet of fresh, heavily compacted snow. The farm demands continuous backbreaking labor regardless of the weather, offering no reprieve from mourning, exhaustion, or hesitation. Surviving the morning will require pushing your depleted physical reserves far beyond their perceived limits. You consider the other widows scattered across the remote valley, a silent fraternity of hardened women who manage the impossible every single day. They gather at the mercantile on rare trading days, exchanging subtle, imperceptible nods that communicate volumes of shared suffering without a single spoken word. One older woman had squeezed her hand during the darkest week of autumn, a brief, crushing grip that transferred an immense amount of unspoken fortitude. You draw upon that shared resilience now, channeling the collective endurance of the frontier wives who refuse to be broken by the harsh land. They stand as living proof that a shattered heart does not preclude the ability to swing a heavy axe or mend the broken fence. You gaze around the dimly lit kitchen, realizing how drastically your relationship with the physical structure has shifted over the past agonizing months. The farmhouse is no longer merely a shared home. It is an adversary you must constantly outwit and a sanctuary you must fiercely protect. Every creaking floorboard and drafty window casing represents a mechanical failure that falls exclusively under your sovereign jurisdiction. You have learned to diagnose the building's structural elements by sound alone, anticipating the needs of the timber and stone with calculating efficiency. This solitary mastery over your environment provides a hard-earned, gritty confidence that effectively tempers the ever-present, haunting loneliness. Silence hangs heavy in the hallway leading to the back bedroom, an expectant hush that precedes the inevitable end of your solitary watch. The child will wake soon, demanding hot sustenance, physical warmth, and the comforting illusion of a secure, unthreatened existence. You will provide all of these necessities, masking your immense bone-deep exhaustion behind a practiced, impenetrable facade of maternal capability. The immense responsibility of shielding that young, fragile mind from the brutal realities of the 1880 wilderness is your most crucial, unrelenting task. You find unparalleled strength in this obligation, using the absolute necessity of providing care as an impenetrable shield against your own encroaching despair. You rub your rough palms together vigorously, generating a meager, fleeting friction that does little to warm the icy stiffness locking your finger joints. The thick frost on the window panes has taken on a faint, pearlescent quality, reflecting the dying yellow light of the kerosene lamp in intricate, fractal patterns. A stray, freezing drap snakes swiftly across your bare ankles, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of frozen earth and deep winter desolation. You ignore the violet shivering that racks your tired frame, focusing instead on the steady, rhythmic sound of your own measured breathing. The severe physical discomfort is merely a temporary state, a minor, fleeting inconvenience compared to the monumental, ongoing task of enduring the emotional void. You rest your heavy head against the high wooden back of the rocking chair, the carved spindles pressing firmly and painfully against your skull. The long, terrifying night has extracted a massive toll, leaving you drained of adrenaline and operating solely on the fumes of sheer, unadulterated stubbornness. You watch the minute hand of the brass mantle clock inch inexorably toward the hour, anticipating the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere that precedes the dawn. The blizzard may have trapped you physically within these wooden walls, but it has failed utterly to break the iron core of your resolve. You will face the brutal morning chores with the same grim, unyielding determination that carried you safely through the darkest, most dangerous hours of the siege. The first hint of morning does not arrive with a triumphant burst of golden sunlight, but rather as a slow, agonizing thinning of the absolute blackness pressing against the window panes. You remain seated in the rocking chair, watching as the thick layers of frost transform from impenetrable pitch into a bruised, translucent indigo that seems to pulse with the frigid temperature. The silence that settled over the farmhouse hours ago now feels less like a threat and more like a profound, exhausted surrender by the warring elements. The wind has vanished completely, leaving behind a stillness so deep and absolute that the rhythmic ticking of the mantle clock seems to vibrate through the very floorboards. You realize with a slow, creeping certainty that the brutal, relentless siege of the 1880 blizzard has finally broken, leaving you battered but undeniably victorious in your solitary vigil. The long night of terror has passed, yielding to a day that will demand labor, but no longer immediate survival against the screaming gale. You push yourself up from the wooden chair, every joint in your body protesting with a chorus of sharp, stinging aches that radiate deep into your marrow. The heavy buffalo coat, which served as your impenetrable armor throughout the terrifying night, now feels like a crushing weight pulling your exhausted shoulders toward the floor. You unfasten the stiff leather toggles with clumsy, unresponsive fingers, letting the massive hide slide from your back to drape heavily over the top of the rocking chair. The sudden exposure to the ambient air of the kitchen sends a violent shiver down your spine, but it also brings a sharp, clarifying sense of physical release and freedom. You stretch your arms high above your head, grimacing as the tense muscles in your lower back pop and release the coiled anxiety they have harbored for countless hours. Your body feels hollowed out, a fragile shell running entirely on the fading fumes of adrenaline and the stubborn necessity of continuing onward. Walking toward the frosted window, you raise a calloused hand to the glass, wiping away a thin layer of condensation that has formed on the interior surface during your watch. The world revealed outside the pane is completely unrecognizable. A blindingly white, sculpted landscape of rolling drifts and smoothed edges that has buried the familiar geometry of the farm beneath a pristine ocean. The wooden fence posts have vanished entirely under the massive accumulation, and the path to the barn is now a solid, unbroken wall of compacted snow waiting to be painstakingly conquered. Yet, the roof of the outbuilding remains starkly visible against the pale morning sky, a sturdy, intact silhouette that confirms the survival of the livestock sheltering within its heavy timber walls. The terrifying isolation of the night has been replaced by a quiet, pristine isolation of morning, demanding intense labor but no longer threatening immediate, violent destruction. You stare at the transformed valley, acknowledging the sheer, terrifying power of the frontier to erase and reshape the world in a single evening. You turn away from the blinding reflection of the snow and move slowly toward the cast iron stove, the reliable iron heart of the battered, enduring farmhouse. The firebox requires banking for the coming hours, a careful arrangement of ash and embers designed to preserve the remaining heat without demanding constant, active supervision while you rest. You use the heavy iron poker to push the glowing red coals into a tight, compact mound against the thick back wall of the fire brick lining, shielding them from the direct draft. A thick layer of fine, powdery gray ash is carefully shoveled over the top of the coals, choking off the oxygen supply just enough to force a slow, smoldering burn that will last until mid-morning. Closing the metal damper requires a precise, practiced twist of the wrist, sealing the stove and guaranteeing that a bed of hot embers will be waiting when you finally rise to face the digging. The real trick and heat against your shins lessens immediately, signaling the end of the emergency heating and the return to a sustainable, measured warmth. The yellow light of the kerosene lamp has grown weak and sickly against the encroaching natural illumination of the dawn filtering to the iced glass of the eastern windows. You reach for the small brass knob on the side of the burner, twisting it slowly to lower the wick until the flame sputters and dies with a faint wisp of dark, pungent smoke. The sudden absence of the artificial light casts the kitchen into a cool, blue-tone palette, highlighting the tiny dust motes suspended perfectly still in the frigid, undisturbed air. The scent of the extinguished lamp oil mixes cleanly with the lingering aroma of the yeast dough and the sharp, metallic tang of the winter morning seeping through the floorboards. You stand in the center of the room, absorbing the tranquil atmosphere of the surviving house, allowing the intense, frantic adrenaline of the night to finally drain completely from your weary veins. The transition from darkness to daylight brings a profound psychological relief, lifting the oppressive shroud of fear that had accompanied the howling blizzard. You walk softly down the narrow hallway, the wooden floorboards offering only the faintest, muffled creak beneath the thick wool of your heavy, hand-knitted socks. The door to the child's bedroom remains slightly ajar, exactly as you left it hours ago during the height of the chaotic, terrifying windstorm that threatened to tear the roof away. Peeking through the narrow opening, you see the small mound beneath the heavy patchwork quilts rising and falling in a deep, undisturbed rhythm of peaceful, ignorant slumber. The pale morning light catches the colorful squares of fabric, illuminating the careful, tiny stitches you sewed by hand during the long, lonely evenings of the fading autumn. A profound, overwhelming wave of protective warmth swells in your chest, momentarily eclipsing the bone-deep physical exhaustion radiating through your tired, trembling limbs. You linger in the doorway for a long moment, drawing immense strength from the simple, undeniable fact that you successfully guarded this fragile life through the darkest hours. Stepping back from the door, you realize that the crushing weight of the grief that hounded your every step during the darkness has subtly changed its texture and its hold. The sorrow is still present, a permanent foundation stone mortared into the very architecture of your life, but it no longer feels like an active, attacking force trying to pull you under. Surviving this brutal historic storm entirely on your own has forged a new, undeniable layer of gritty resilience over the raw, exposed nerves of your broken and grieving heart. You have proven to the frontier, to the memory of the man you lost, and most importantly to yourself, that you are capable of holding the line against the worst calamities the world can conjure. The future remains uncertain and undoubtedly filled with backbreaking labor, but the paralyzing terror of facing it alone has been fundamentally shattered by this morning's quiet, solitary victory. You wipe a single stray tear from your cheek, not of sorrow but of a profound, overwhelming relief that the ordeal is finally over. You continue down the corridor toward your own bedroom, the air growing progressively colder as you move further away from the banked heat of the kitchen stove and deeper into the unheated wing. The large oak bedstead sits waiting in the dim light, the heavy wool blankets pulled tight across the mattress in a neat, orderly fashion that belies the desperate chaos of the night before. The empty space on the far side of the mattress no longer evokes a sharp, breathless panic. Instead, it simply exists as a quiet, accepted reality of your newly shaped, solitary world. You sit slowly on the edge of the mattress, the woven rope supports groaning softly in protest under your weight, and begin the arduous process of unlacing your stiff leather boots. The rigid laces resist your tired fingers, requiring a final stubborn exertion of willpower before the heavy footwear drops to the floorboards with a dull, satisfying thud that echoes in the quiet room. You rub your cramped arches through the wool, feeling the abused muscles twitching in protest after bearing your weight through miles of pacing and frantic labor. You peel the thick, damp wool socks from your aching feet, relishing the sudden rush of cool air against skin that has been suffocated and blistered for hours inside the rigid leather confines. The sheer physical relief of removing the heavy, restrictive clothing feels akin to shedding a suit of armor after a protracted, grueling campaign on an unforgiving battlefield. You pull the thick quilts back, slipping beneath the heavy layers of woven wool and carded cotton, feeling the immediate, sharp contrast of the freezing linen sheets against your tired, bare legs. The mattress conforms to the shape of your exhausted body, a supportive embrace that demands you finally surrender the rigid, upright posture you have fiercely maintained throughout the long night. You pull the heavy blankets up to your chin, burrowing deep into the dark, insulated cocoon, actively embracing the encroaching heaviness settling firmly over your weary mind. The world outside the window has ceased to matter. The only priority now is the absolute biological necessity of restorative slumber before the daylight chores demand your return. The transition toward rest brings a hyper-specific awareness of the silent, settling world within the frozen farmhouse as your senses begin to detach from the burdens of survival. You hear the exact, dry crackle of a single hardwood ember shifting from a glowing red to a dull, powdery gray in the distant kitchen stove. The specific, microscopic scrape of fresh frost crystals locking together on the inside of the bedroom window pane traces a delicate, creeping pattern across the chilling glass. A slow, deep groan reverberates through the ceiling joints above you as the massive oak house timbers contract imperceptibly in the plunging post-storm cold. The faint, greasy smell of extinguished tallow smoke clings stubbornly to the fibers of the room, a ghostly reminder of the long, anxious vigil just past. The dense, woven weight of the wool blanket presses down uniformly against your chest, anchoring your tired bones securely to the soft mattress. A distant, muffled thud from the direction of the barn reveals the draft horse shifting its massive weight in the fresh, dry straw. The pale morning light stretches softly across the wooden floorboards, signaling that the longest vigil is finally at its end. You close your eyes, rest well. History keeps its story safe until you're ready to visit again.